Okay, so for tear down on the gun, we want to make sure that the fluid valves are off and the air supply is removed. We'll want to service the screens first. That way we can use the gun for leverage. You have the B side screen and the A side screen. Now this would still be attached to the fluid hose. Check valve and screen, the A side. The screen got left in the port, which often the case on the ISO side. We'll get at that after we removed our side blocks. So now we're going to want to remove the side blocks from the gun head. We're going to leave them attached to the hose. So overnight, we would actually make sure that these areas are clean. We'd just cap them with some grease. Removing the O-ring, we'd make sure everything was clean. So we would just reassemble. Let's go spring, ball, and then the ball check will actually seat there. We'll get our screen back on. I like to make sure I get some fusion lube on the threads. Again, remember these are attached to the hose. And just for video purposes, you see how that spring, you want to make sure it's fully recessed in the bore, and then it will accept the ball a little easier. Kind of keep it straight till we get it started so that ball stays in place. So then these would still actually be attached to the gun hose and set aside. So we're going to actually need one of the side seal assemblies when we go to do the piston lock, piston throw setup. After we've taken this gun apart, we always need to adjust the piston throw to line up the center port of the impingement with the center of the side seal, and we'll use this as a target. But when we get the gun back together, we'll go through that process. So at this point, we want to remove the air line. And this air assembly actually has a ball and a spring to help crossover from happening. There we go. So again, this is just air service. So this ball will check one way so the air can go in, but the crossover fluid can't go back into your airstream. Then we have the two O-rings on the air slide valve, the smaller one, and then the bigger one. So at this time we can remove our air cap. We're actually going to pop this O-ring off. We can soak that cap in the mix chamber insert and solvent overnight. If we have to, we can drill our mix chambers if we're not going to go all the way in. There's a hole, we call it the exit hole. We need to make sure that that hole gets cleaned out of there, because it actually sits behind this mix chamber. So even though we can clean out this nozzle in the morning, we want to make sure what we call the exit hole in the bottom of that mix chamber. When I get the chamber, I'll try to get a better look at that. We want to make sure that is also clear. People kind of forget about that one. So now we can remove the gun head from the air cylinder. So you'll notice the size of the mix chamber, this one happens to be a AA, it's our smallest, is etched into the top. There's no A or B etched. I always say if we keep the label to the top of the mix chamber, we'll always get it back and it'll be the same. Just want to go ahead and remove that mix chamber from the air piston. And we'll see if we can get maybe a better look of the hole. You see that recessed hole is actually beyond the side seal impingement port hole. So we want to make sure that little bit of recess gets cleaned out of there. And now that we have it out, we can do a better job in making sure that hole is clean. Okay, so now go ahead and remove the safety stop air cap off the back. And I'm going to actually remove the trigger spool. So we have the plug, we have a spring, and we have the air valve with the 3 O-rings. We want to make sure that we keep from scratching the bore so we don't compromise those O-rings. Okay, so once we've removed the air trigger spool, we just want to remove the O-rings. I got new ones in the kit. Making sure there's no burrs. Be careful with that spool. And before we forget about them and lose these 2 O-rings right here, there's one air seal O-ring on the interface of this air cylinder, and there's one smaller one here that brings the air purge. So if we don't take those out of there, we'll forget about them and we'll end up losing them. So this gun is unique that we have a dual piston design. So there's actually a center wall and 2 pistons. So we could keep the head smaller in size, but increase our force or work to move this piston back and forth. So when we take that apart, we actually have to do it in sections because that center wall is retained behind this rear piston. So we'll want to remove the rear piston first. So these piston assemblies are actually made out of aluminum, so we want to take a little care on the wrench. And don't use a crescent wrench on the flats. They'll get rounded off pretty quickly. Actually, a 7mm wrench fits quite nicely. We're going to get this cap loosened up. So after a bit, the O-ring is still giving us some tension, so we got to carefully with a pair of pliers kind of turn and pull. You can see this is the rear piston assembly. And now if you look into the gun, you'll see we have this retaining ring and what I call a stationary wall. So to get this front piston assembly out, we have to remove that retaining ring and then we can get that piston out of there. So I like to get it where it's flat. Just going to grab this retaining ring, work it out slowly so we don't send it across the room. So just a standard retaining ring. Okay, so I like to get this onto a flat surface. I leave the set screw in, get a dead blow hammer, and we just want to come up against that stationary wall. So what we have here, essentially when this is all together, the center wall is retained with the retaining ring, and now I have all this surface and all this surface providing the force, but yet I kept the gun smaller, so it's lighter weight, easier to maneuver, more ergonomically friendly. So it's a nice lightweight gun, but I have the added power of this dual piston design. But with the dual piston design, I also have a few more O-rings we have to pay attention to that will be in the kit. I get the grease off of these and we'll find those O-rings. We'll go ahead and get these O-rings off. If you're going to get this far into the gun, you should buy a complete O-ring kit. I would definitely consider genuine Graco parts. Our O-rings are designed for the temperatures and the chemicals that we see typical for this application, and they'll last longer, they're more solvent resistant, and worth the money. So we actually have a small one here. There we go. And that center or stationary wall also has a sealing O-ring on the ID. Okay, so the passageways on this gun, they're actually, you can see all these small set screws. So the passageways are drilled and then drilled, so we had to put the set screws on the outside. So if you've really crossed over this handle, you're going to have to remove all these screws. Do it on a clean surface so you don't lose any of them. And we can run the drill bit straight through all the ports and make sure that all the ports are clean. And then we'll replace those port sealing set screws. This one on top is actually for an accessory chop assembly or counter or a couple of the other options that we can add to the gun. And that's what this port is for, so you can leave that one in unless we're working with that option. So that's essentially the gun broken down, except for the side seals. In this case, we're going to remove the housing from the hoses to get them onto the bench and clean. Because remember, we're going to need this side seal assembly. I want you to see what it looks like inside, and we're also going to use this as the target to set that piston throw. And we'll do that when we get it back together again. So let's remove one of those guys so you can see what it looks like. So because these are not marked A and B, we have to be mindful of keeping them separated. We want the B to match up with the B side. Now the housing is actually marked ISO for the A or the ISO side, and the B is not marked at all. So, but the components internal are not marked or different. So we just want to kind of keep those separate. Remove those O-rings and replace those from the complete O-ring kit. This gun uses a mechanical seal. So we have the spring tension that holds the honed surface on the mix chamber and the honed surface on the side seal. We want to make sure they're free of defect. If I can catch it with a thumbnail, they should be replaced or cleaned up. So that seal under spring tension is just going to create the fluid seal. So I want to make sure all those stay good and clean. This rear retainer is also a seal. It's a harder seal. It's not an O-ring. We want to make sure it's visually not cracked or distorted. And we're going to remove the A side as well, because we're going to get a new O-ring with a side seal on this one in the kit. Get that out of the way. So we got the O-ring, side seal again. We're looking at the surface and the cap and the spring, making sure there's no cracks or distortion. So that'll actually be the rear seal. So we've already serviced the screens in the earlier video. If we were totally rebuilding the gun, we could remove those and replace or clean the screens as well. That's the gun kind of laid out and totally disassembled.